Hello, I'm Robert M. Ellis, and this is the first of a planned series of video lectures, informal video lectures on the Christian Middle Way. So it accompanies the launch of my book, The Christian Middle Way, which I hope you'll be inspired to go and look at for more detail. But the idea behind these lectures is, well, twofold. It could help to provide a way in to get you interested in the book in the first place, and it might also help people who prefer a more audiovisual way of presenting things to get into the arguments in the book, even if you do read the book or are reading the book. So in this first lecture I'm going to be looking at faith and belief, and I'm going to be looking at the middle way as general ideas. So both of those are in the title of the book and the subtitle. So the title is The Christian Middle Way, and the subtitle is The Case Against Christian Belief but for Christian Faith. So I'm obviously making a basic distinction there between belief and faith, even though they're commonly used in the same way in Christian context at the moment, and the basis of that distinction is the middle way as a general approach. The place where I start with this is uncertainty. That's where the middle way begins, really. So uncertainty is the human condition. Uncertainty is where we're at, just by virtue of the fact that we're not God, so we don't have an absolute view of things. Anything we believe may be wrong. However well supported it may be, we can't take it completely for granted. We can always be surprised by new information. And the whole history of human development, particularly the history of science, shows lots of ways in which people in the past have been constantly surprised and their views of the world have been constantly overturned by new developments. So if God is anything, then God is mysterious, and God is giving us surprises. You know, God is about giving us surprises and having a bigger outlook. So in some ways, I think the ways in which people relate to God and think about God, there's that component, that way of thinking about God in terms of uncertainty, that's one of the key ways I want to relate the Christian tradition to the middle way. If you start with uncertainty, then you need to avoid essentializing. So not only do you need to recognize that the beliefs we might have about things may be wrong, but also that there's no absolute way even of speaking, and the words that we use are used for certain purposes. They're used to communicate, they're used to understand. We can change the way we talk about things. So perhaps at the very start I'm going to need to head off those who will begin to say, what are you talking about? You know, Christians believe in God. How can there be Christianity without belief? To which my answer is, well, Christianity is a tradition. It's a very varied and mixed tradition, and this is one way of interpreting it, which I hope is a helpful way of interpreting it. It's certainly in need of new forms of interpretation that meet people's needs and meet people's experience, because at the moment church attendance in Western countries at least is dying on its feet. The numbers speak for themselves. I'm not going to go through them, but there's some mention of them in my book. So uncertainty is my starting point, and with that uncertainty also comes responsibility for interpretation. So I want to start off by saying we are responsible for how we interpret the Christian tradition. You are responsible for how you interpret the Christian tradition. It may be that there are influential friends and neighbours and clergy and people you've met who say there's only one way of interpreting it, or assume that there's only one way of interpreting it that's true and right and essential, but it's up to you whether you accept that or not. Once you start to become aware of the alternatives, it's your choice. That's why I suggest that you do think about the alternatives. If in the end you stay with the traditional one, then at least you thought about it. So there is a principle of interpretative responsibility in the whole way in which I approach the Christian tradition. That is, that the way in which we interpret Christianity should not be dictated by any kind of absolute assumptions about revelation, that God communicates in a particular way, or indeed about history, that there is a particular set of historical events which should dictate our interpretation of it, our understanding of it. Because there is always a great deal of ambiguity about anything that's supposed to be a communication from God, anything that's supposed to have happened in history, particularly a long time ago. So again, I'm not going to be involved here in scholarly argument about the Bible, not because I don't appreciate the labours of scholars and everything they've done, but because I think in the end that evidence is always going to be ambiguous, and it's up to us to decide what is the most helpful way of interpreting that evidence. So we need a pragmatic approach to Christianity. So the middle way, which is the basis of all my work really in the last 20 years or so, middle way philosophy as I call it, that I've written about in lots of other books. The middle way involves sticking to the implications of uncertainty. Taking uncertainty seriously, taking human embodiment seriously. And that means not that we only abandon positive certainties, but we also avoid negative ones. So it leaves us in a space where we recognise that we neither know nor do we not know. There's no basis of denial, just as much as there's no basis of assertion. At the same time, we lead lives in which we do make constant practical judgments. So I'm not suggesting for a moment that we should try to live in a practical way. I'm not suggesting we should be indecisive, and I'm not suggesting that we should indeed be weak or ultra-liberal, or I'm not suggesting that we should fail to face up to any of the conditions around us, which might include all kinds of difficulties and difficult people and difficult politics and so on. So please don't start off assuming that that's the implication. So we can have faith, if you like, so coming to that main point of faith and belief. We can avoid having kind of absolute beliefs that are traditionally the fare of the Christian creeds and so on, but at the same time we can have faith. Now in our everyday lives we have faith in all sorts of ways. It's closely related to the ways in which our bodies respond to things, or we in our bodies respond to things. So we're used to things physically working in a particular way. So when I put my hand on a door handle and move that handle down, I expect the door to open. I don't go around quizzing that all the time, asking, is this door going to open or not? I'm used to it working in that way. When I sit down on a chair, I expect it to hold my weight. There are occasions when we need to question those things, but most of the time we live in a confident way. Confident also in our relationships with others. We expect others to respond in certain reasonably predictable ways. Somebody who's known to you to be a kind person is not suddenly going to explode at you and be upset in a completely unpredictable way. So we have a basis of confidence in the world, and I think that's often what Christians are helpfully getting at when they talk about their faith in God. So they talk about God, or indeed Jesus, as a person, and they talk about their confidence or trust in that person. So that's got a lot to do, I think, with their relationship with the whole of their experience, and I'll come more to what God means, or what we mean by God in a minute. But so faith, in the way I'm talking about it, is embodied. On the other hand, absolute beliefs are what I think we need to avoid. So the middle way consists in the avoidance of absolute beliefs, whether positive or negative. Now, what's an absolute belief, you might ask? And it is important to get this clear. So absolute beliefs aren't they're certainly not restricted to fundamentalism, for example, although fundamentalists are normally absolutist. There are a number of different absolute beliefs that we may have, and it's not just extremists who have absolute beliefs. We all have them to some extent. The question is, to what extent? What beliefs do we hold that are absolute? And whenever we assume something and we act in a certain way, then we hold beliefs in relation to it. So we can hold absolute beliefs even if we don't recognise it. So what are absolute beliefs? Well, absolute beliefs admit no alternatives except their negation. So if you think about the existence of God as one of the kinds of absolute beliefs we're talking about here, if you believe absolutely in the existence of God, then it's very likely that you won't really consider any alternative to theism on the one hand and atheism on the other. It may be that you don't understand alternatives, you haven't really encountered alternatives. Agnosticism might seem to you to be a weird, wishy-washy intellectual concept which doesn't mean very much to you. I'm going to suggest agnosticism could be quite a decisive, courageous thing to embrace. It's just realistic. It's just coming to terms with our embodied nature, the uncertainty in which we live. But absolute beliefs can be defined in that way, that when you hold an absolute belief, or more strictly, when you make an absolute judgment, at that point you are not considering any alternatives but the negation of that absolute belief. Which is why the only alternative you're considering, the negation, seems threatening. So in a way you feel you have to hold that belief because it's the only reasonable alternative. That's why you hear so often absolutist Christians and other religionists saying that, you know, God and their faith as they call it, their beliefs, are the only thing that makes their life meaningful, and that anything else would be relativist, would be atheist, would be, you know, all these words which actually for them reflect evils. Anything else would be evil. Absolute beliefs are not incremental, so you cannot hold an absolute belief to an extent. You can't see it as a matter of degree. So obviously that applies to belief in the existence of God, or belief that Jesus is your saviour, or any of these classic Christian beliefs. That means that God doesn't exist to some extent. Either God exists or God doesn't exist. It's non-incremental, which is what absolute means. And what's wrong with such absolute beliefs? Well, if it's not already becoming clear, provides a shortcut that insulates people from the information that they might get from experience and the justification that they might get from experience. So it's a way of blocking off any challenging new information that might make you change your point of view. So if you hold an absolute belief, you are then very likely to continually interpret any new ambiguous information in terms of that absolute belief. So if you believe that God created the world, for example, you will understand everything in terms of that createdness. Now, there's often a tricky issue here in distinguishing the experience we have, the positive experience that Christians may associate with the created nature of the world, and the absolute belief that they've attached to it. I think, and I'm going to carry on arguing, in fact, that they can be separated. It's quite possible to experience that positive sense that you may associate with the belief that God created the world, a positive response to the world. It's quite possible to dissociate that from the absolute belief that God created the world. It may take practice, may take a deliberate intention followed through to be a Christian agnostic in effect, but it's possible. When you do that, you can free yourself from the confirmation bias, which is the basis of absolute belief. So you actually begin to have a choice about how you can interpret things, rather than feeling that you either have to take things in this absolute way or anything else will be terrible. So it's a way of freeing yourself if you can get away from absolute belief. Now, beliefs about God are only one of many possible absolute beliefs, so please don't think that I'm only getting at theism. I really am not. Free will and determinism is another very important one, which has a lot of influence. Beliefs about the mind and the body, beliefs about ourselves, political beliefs, beliefs about boundaries and nations and races, and so there were a lot of different absolute beliefs, or beliefs that can be absolute and can be interpreted absolutely around. God is by no means the only one. So absolute beliefs which are avoided in the middle way can be contrasted with provisional beliefs. Now, it's very important that we don't just contrast absolute beliefs with relative beliefs, and part of the problem with the discourse as it generally goes on about this is that people contrast absolute and relative rather than absolute and provisional, or absolute and agnostic. But relative beliefs, very often, it depends how you interpret the term, but very often they are negative absolutes. So they are denials, for example, denials that God exists and God provides goodness and the basis of value in the world. Well, we don't know that. The problem is one of our interpretation and our limited, uncertain experience. It's not a problem of whether there is or is not a God. We don't know. So we can be open to what it means to talk about God, and to talk about God's actions and so on, without believing in those things. Instead, we can have provisional beliefs, and so obviously we do need beliefs in everyday life. We make assumptions all the time, like the kinds of ones I mentioned earlier that we can have faith in. So I believe the chair will support my weight. I believe that my wife's going to come home tonight, etc. And whether these are factual beliefs or beliefs about values, whatever they are, we can have beliefs. But if they're provisional, then we can weigh them up against alternatives and we can make judgments about them, rather than being forced to think in a particular way without there being alternatives. And that's what makes the difference. It comes down to what's actually going on in your brain, whether there is an alternative available to you, whether those little synaptic connections have actually created alternatives for you or not. Because alternatives are creative and adaptive, whereas dogmas and absolutes are not. If you've only got one way of looking at the world, then you're stuck. The conditions change, you don't change with them. So, absolute beliefs are contrasted with provisional beliefs, and faith, in the way I'm using the term, is really just, it's an aspect of provisional, it's a way of talking about the more emotive aspect of provisional beliefs. So faith needs to be provisional, which is just a way of saying it's responsive, it's related to our experience of things. So yes, I have confidence when I sit down in the chair that it won't collapse, but I would also be responding pretty quick, maybe almost unconsciously or physically, if it did begin to show signs of collapse, if I felt a lack of support from the legs of the chair. So that's the distinction that's communicated in my book, really, between belief and faith. And a lot of what the book is about really is, well, it's asking the question, what are Christians getting at? And I mean, that's something I've wondered about for a lot of my life. So a lot of my life I haven't been thinking of myself as a Christian. There have been times when I did, in some sense, but a lot of my life I haven't. But as time's gone on, I've increasingly wondered, what are they getting at? Why do they have these beliefs? Why does this mean so much to them? Why is it so important? And I really do think that they're onto something important. So there's a great deal of unnecessary dismissal of religion under the entire Christian tradition, made by people like the New Atheists, like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins and so on, who've become well known for their polarised opposition to religion. But religion is a complicated business. You really cannot pigeonhole it and essentialise it. You've really got to start looking at it, at its complexity, and being responsible for what you say about it and how you judge it. So Christians are getting at something, I think. They experience God. So the religious experiences, which they want to call experiences of God. And I've had experiences myself which I could describe in that way, or I could describe in other ways. They have experiences of Jesus. Similarly, Jesus has a particular role for them. These are not all simply delusions. They're experiences. So we need to think about what those experiences mean, not what absolutes they tell us. That's the wrong question to ask it. That will lead us straight down a very stupid avenue of thinking. What we need to think about is what they mean, and what they mean is a different thing from what one needs to believe about them, or absolute beliefs that one needs to reach about them. So the meaning of things is a set of resources linked to our experience, are ways of symbolising our experience, talking about our experience, prior to the beliefs that we form about it. And faith is very much linked to our access to meaning. So, in another lecture, I will talk in more detail, perhaps, about religious experience. But just for a moment, a little bit about what God might mean in these terms. So, I draw a good deal on Carl Jung, and his theory of archetypes. Although, yeah, there are issues in the interpretation of Jungian archetypes. But an archetype, I think, quite straightforwardly, is a human function. So there are certain needs and desires that humans have, which will produce certain kinds of expression. And one would expect that kind of expression to happen everywhere. So a very obvious example of that is what Jung calls the shadow. So the shadow is an archetype of evil. And all over the world, there are humans have things they don't like. You know, so it's a very basic human function. You know, so there are some things we want, and there are some things we don't want. There are some things we reject and hate and have aversion to, and those are what we call evil. So when we come across something and we identify it with something we assume to be evil, we project the shadow onto it. So it's another way of talking about our tendency to believe that something or somebody is evil. So evil, again, is part of our experience. You can't just kick it away. So we have archetypal experience of evil, we have archetypal experiences of good as well. I mean, in Jung there are four major archetypes. So there's the hero, which is about our aspirations for ourselves, the ego archetype, you could say, when we have fantasies about ourselves winning and having achievements. That's the hero archetype, and we might project that onto somebody else because, yeah, we think about, you know, Harry Potter or somebody having these achievements and successes and beating the adversary in order to fulfill their desires. And then there's the animal of Animus, which usually takes the other sex form, but it's an attractive other. So the part of ourselves, part of our experience that we are attracted to, but that we don't possess, would like to possess, in some sense. So that could be, very often is, somebody of the opposite sex, but it could also be an attractive landscape, for example. It could be take a different form from that. And then the difficult one, though, the big archetype, which Jung identified, he called the God Archetype or the Self Archetype. And that's really about our potential, or a glimpse, I think, of our potential. It's the archetype of the Unified Psyche. That is, the potential we have to overcome our conflicts and to be a single, whole person. And you don't necessarily have to think of that in only individual terms. So the potential of the world and of our relationship to the world to be single and whole, again, is God. It's glimpsed in a very gestalt way all at once. It's a very intuitive thing. So it's not something you're going to be able to pin down just for analysis. It's not an abstraction, in other words, which is why it's not an object of absolute belief. So the archetypal experience of God, well, maybe an image that could help to bring this home. Supposing you're standing on a hill in the darkness, in a storm, and then there's a flash of lightning that for a moment illuminates a vast plain in front of you, and you didn't realise this plain was there until the flash of lightning. Gave you that huge sense of space and awe as you encountered that openness. Now, I'd suggest that the God Archetype, an experience of the God Archetype, is a bit like that. It's an awareness, in some sense, that you are a lot bigger than you thought you were, and that the potential of what you can be, and indeed what others in the world can be, as an extension of that, is much greater than you thought it was. So it's associated with a sense of meaningfulness, a sense of openness, relatedness, So it can also occur in relation to others, and a sense of how others are connected and part of a bigger potential, and of moving beyond limitations that we previously had. Now, you might see that as a psychological, so-called psychological explanation of God. And I think, well, Christians have been misunderstanding this, or a lot of them have, for some time. So, okay, that's one way of understanding what's going on when people talk about God. It's not in any way an attempt to reduce God to some other terms which provide you an ultimate explanation. The whole point about God is he's beyond our ability to pin him down. He's always beyond what we can say and what we can talk about. So any set of descriptions is going to be, inadequate. But that applies to the biblical ones as well. Yeah. So if you really sincerely believe that you can get a set of words off the Bible and that really tells you what God is really like, then you're not taking human embodiment and uncertainty into account. And I would regard that as a very arrogant position. Really, it's a position which really doesn't respect God. It's a position that's an irreligious position, really. If you try and get to the core of what religion could be trying to communicate to us, it's the respect for uncertainty, respect for that openness. So there's something deeply irreligious about taking beliefs from the Bible or tradition or the Pope or any source really, and claiming that these human ideas, because that's what they are God's beliefs, beliefs that God gave you. God put you in a position of uncertainty. That's the symbolically, that's the post-Eden position. You've been cast out of the garden. You're in a world of uncertainty now, so you've got the responsibility of working out what all this is about and what to do with it. So a psychological explanation is another approach within that situation. It is not an alternative command from on high. In other words, it's not a final explanation of anything. And that means it's not a reduction. There is no just about it. It's not just a psychological explanation. You can accept and use a psychological explanation like that in terms of Jung's archetypes, and use it to open up your ideas, your experience of God, your interpretation of God, rather than just seeing it as an enemy, as the only sort of absolute alternative to the church-provided creedal version. Yeah, I'll finish, I think, this first lecture, which has been about faith and belief and the middle way, just by reiterating that point, I think. So you are in that position, whether you're a Christian or not, whether you've got yourself as a Christian, whatever your background, if you encounter Christianity, you have something to do with it, it's up to you how you interpret it. And the rest of the lectures that I will be offering here, and the stuff that's in the book, is really about ways you can interpret the Christian tradition helpfully. So I'll be offering various suggestions about, for example, the creation story, and about Jesus, about the mystical tradition in Christianity, about the conflicts with atheism and science and so on. So there are ways forward in all of that if you take responsibility. If you don't take responsibility, then you're stuck in the kind of things Christianity has often got stuck in recently, which is dogma, conflict, religious war at worst, or just irrelevance, to be honest. So It's your choice. It's up to you. I'll be back in some more lectures to offer more details on this approach. Thank you very much.